Welcome to the fourth and final of our Turing-Manchester project presentations. So these are retrospectives from our Turing Fellows who've been doing projects based at Manchester. And for the final two talks, we've got Niels Peek from the School of Health and Nadia Papamichail from the Business School. So we're going to start with Niels. So Niels is Professor of Health Informatics in the School of Health, and he's going to talk about advancing methodology for predictive healthcare. So over to Niels.
Right, thank you, Magnus. Can you hear me okay? Good. Right, so hello everyone, and for those who do not know me, my name is Niels Peek. I'm Professor of Health Informatics. I work in the Division of Informatics, Imaging and Data Science in the School of Health Sciences, FBMH. I'm also the Pankhurst Lead for Digital Health and Care. I'm going to talk about advancing methodology for predictive healthcare, which is a project that I led and which has recently finished, and which was funded through the Turing. And before I go to the menu for my talk, I just wanted to introduce the group of people that I work with in FBMH, most of whom are actually based in the Center for Health Informatics, but a number of them, a few of them are not. But we've got a really large group of people working on prediction research, so methodologies for clinical risk prediction. Some of the work is more applied, some of the work is more theoretical, and I think that's actually quite nice because the two things then can strengthen each other. And most of the work that I'm going to present today was actually done by the people on this slide and not so much by me, so I think they should deserve due credit, specifically Matt Sperrin, who is here. I hope you can see my cursor, who led on most of the work. So I've got highlighted here actually the people whose work I'm going to present today. So in this talk, I'm going to start with an introduction. So when we say prediction models, what exactly is it that we mean by that? Then I'm going to talk about one project that focuses, a sub-project which focuses specifically on the use of electronic health records to develop clinical prediction models. Then I'm going to talk about interventional risk prediction or causal risk prediction. And then the final topic is dynamic prediction models. And after that, I've got a couple of take-home messages. So let's start with prediction models in health. So what exactly do we mean by that? Well, it's fairly straightforward. So in a prediction model, we typically have a range of predictors, denoted here by X1 through XP. So that would be things like age and sex, diagnosis, medical history, lifestyle, clinical measurements, biomarkers, all those things that we can potentially know about a person, an individual. And then we've got some kind of model that predicts an outcome Y. And typically that would be an event. So whether or not an event has happened in a given time frame, or it could be the time to that event that we are trying to predict. And obviously the two are very closely related. And we can do this basically using any supervised learning method. So we can use good old regression models like logistic regression or Cox regression for time to event models, or we can use something from machine learning, a random forest, support vector machine, neural networks, all those things basically do it. So broadly speaking, there exist two types of prediction models. The first type is diagnostic. These models predict the risk of the current presence of a disease of interest, given the stuff that we know about a person, given the things that we have observed. Prognostic models predict the risk of a future event, typically some kind of trouble, stuff you don't want, for instance, dying or getting cancer or cancer occurrence or stuff like that, heart attacks. based on things that we know now, that we have observed now. So in this talk, I'm going to focus entirely on prognostic models because that is what we focus on within our group. So typically in a prognostic model, we can think of a timeline. So we've got a particular important point in time where we do the prediction, where we make the prediction. And then obviously we've got the time before that, which we define as the observation window over which we have observed things in someone's medical history. Then we've got the prediction window over which we predict, and then the endpoint. As I mentioned before, sometimes the prediction window, the length of that window is fixed. So for instance, we try to predict what is going to happen in the next 12 months, whether or not people would have a particular adverse event in the next 12 months. Sometimes it's not fixed, but we try to predict the time until that will happen. Obviously, any study will always have an endpoint. So that means if we have time to event outcomes, there will always be people for whom we do not know the outcome. We don't, and so they are basically censored at the end of our study. So prediction models typically have a life cycle, and it's exactly what you would expect it to be. So we start by developing a model, then we need to validate it. So we have to assess how good that model really is and whether, for instance, it would generalize to other settings, other countries, perhaps. If we have sufficient evidence that the model is valid, that it is accurate, and that it does generalize to the setting where we want to apply it, then we can implement that model in clinical practice. But then at some point, we probably want to consider updating that model because we know from experience that any model sooner or later will become outdated. And that is just because things change over time. Populations change, clinical practice changes. So at some point we will have to consider updating the model. Whereafter, again, we will probably have to validate it. So it's basically a circular activity. So the first project I want to discuss with you is around prediction with electronic health records. And this is a massively important topic in my field because nowadays, nearly all the information that is collected in the NHS, as well as in other healthcare systems, is electronic. So we've got these vast databases of electronic health records that we can use to develop prediction models. So that's a tremendous opportunity that didn't exist, 10, 20 years ago. And it has the advantage also that the model that you then develop can be deployed directly in the setting where those electronic health records are being kept and collected. So electronic health records typically collect things like visits to general practice, measurements that would be made by that GP, for instance, a blood pressure measurement, things like lab tests, whether any medication was prescribed or other treatments were prescribed, but also things in secondary care. So A&E visits or hospital admissions, visit to the outpatient clinic. All those things will be captured in electronic health records. Some of that information is captured in primary care, so at the general practice, other information is captured at the hospital. What is really important to recognize, though, is that most of the time, there's not going to be any information simply because we are not visiting our GP or the hospital. So, for instance, my GP didn't measure my blood pressure today, and they also didn't measure it yesterday, or actually not for quite a long time, a couple of years probably since it was last measured. I can't quite remember when that was and why it was, but it probably has been measured at some point. But it's fair to say, and it's that the information in the records is actually quite sparse for most people. George Repsack, who's someone who works in my field at Columbia University in New York, once said, the electronic health record, the data in the electronic health record is nearly always missing. And I think that's a correct way of saying it, essentially. So information in the record is only recorded when you actually, when there's a reason, because you don't feel well and you visit your doctor, and otherwise it's just empty. So it's very, very different than traditional research data. So that's important when we start looking at that data and try to use it for prediction purposes, because it means that the very presence of information carries information itself. So the fact that something was measured is meaningful. And perhaps, for instance, so if a blood pressure is measured, well, that means that if my blood pressure was measured today in my general practice, that means I went there, right? So there must have been a reason that I went there, and maybe the blood pressure itself is fine, but the fact that it was measured is carries a lot of information. It says something. So Rose Sisk, who's one of my PhD students, is looking at this particular phenomenon, so which we call informative presence of information and informative observation. So informative observation pertains to the situation where we do multiple measurements over time, as we have here. So this is a blood glucose. This was actually measured in the hospital, not in primary care. And we've got two patients, patient 1 in blue and patient 2 in red. And for patient 2, the blood glucose was fairly normal. And it also wasn't measured very often. Whereas for patient 1, the blood glucose was way too high. And it was also measured much more often. And the two things are actually related, because that blood glucose was too high for patient 1, it was decided each time to measure it very quickly again, as they were trying to get it under control. Whereas in patient 2, it was fine, so there was no need to assess it so often. They were not trying to get it under control. So the number of measurements is much lower. Now, one of the questions that Rose is looking at is how can we take advantage of this particular phenomenon, that the very presence of information and the frequency with which things are being measured is informative itself. And this is something obviously that we would never see in conventional study data, for instance, from a trial. So Rose has conducted a review, which was recently published in the Journal of the American Medical Informatics Association, JAMIA. And in the review, she looked at what kind of studies have appeared looking at these two phenomena, informative presence and informative observation. And basically what we found is that, broadly speaking, there are three ways to address this, at least if you look at the studies that have been published. So the first, and this is also the largest group of studies, they basically define measurement patterns and then have predictors that indicate whether a particular pattern was present or not, and use that in the model. And very often then it is found indeed that the presence of those particular measurement patterns is predictive. Not all of them, but some of them are predictive of health outcomes. Then a second approach is what we call modeling under informed presence, which was a much smaller group, 4 studies. And the final approach, which is probably the most general, but also the one that is most complex from, well, both a statistical and a computational perspective, is using latent processes and structures. For instance, hidden Markov models can be used to model the type of process that we just saw on the previous slide. Or you can use joint models. So models basically model the expected time until the next observation, and in the second part of the joint model the time until the adverse event, so that the outcome model. As I said, this is a relatively complex approach from a computational perspective, but it is the one that is most general. So let's move on to the second project, which is about interventional risk prediction or causal risk prediction. So these models the prediction models are typically used in clinical practice to identify patients who are in need of getting an intervention. So for instance, there exist models that identify people who are at high risk, relatively high risk, of getting a heart attack or a stroke over the next 5 to 10 years. And if that's the case, then guidelines, the NICE guidelines, would typically say that an intervention has to be considered, and that the typical intervention there is treatment with statins. Now, there's alternatives as well. So, for instance, in first instance, one might consider a lifestyle intervention, but from a medical perspective, it's statins that would be on the table as the possible way to address that risk. Now, there was a really interesting paper from Miguel Hernan, one of my heroes, published in 2019 in the journal Chance, and Hernan said that identifying people with bad prognosis is very different from identifying the best course of action for preventing or treating a disease. And I think that's absolutely right. It's absolutely spot on, but not something that many people are aware of. And Miguel Hernan has really expressed it very well, I think, in this paper. Because it's also the case that if we use predictive models and try to use them for causal inference, then we might draw the wrong conclusions and therefore take the wrong decisions. So prediction models can inform us that decisions have to be made, but they can't help us to make the actual decisions. They can't tell us what needs to happen. So in contrast, if we use a form of causal reasoning, then we can start to tackle questions as, what is it that needs to happen? So this is an area that we've been looking at over the last couple of years, and we call this approach causal risk prediction or interventional risk prediction. So also in this area, we've recently published a review. So this work was conducted by Li-Jing Lin and Matt Sperrin. So this was published in a journal called Diagnostic and Prognostic Research. What we did is basically identify approaches for making predictions under hypothetical interventions using causal reasoning methods. So at the intersection of prediction and causal inference, we found 12 papers in the literature that do this, both from statistical modeling and machine learning. And broadly speaking, we identified two approaches. So the first is to develop a prediction models from observational data, as we always do, but then essentially plug in external estimates from causal effects from, for instance, a randomized trial or a systematic review of randomized trials. So we use two sources of information. One is purely causal and the other is observational, and we use that to develop the model, but we plug in those causal effect estimates. The second approach is different. It uses only one source of information, observational data, as we always tend to do, but it now uses methods from counterfactual reasoning to estimate those causal effect estimates directly from the observational data. Now, this one is much more challenging. It's also potentially an approach with which we can do more, but it's challenging, and it also, we have to make a number of assumptions, for instance, on observed confounding in the observational data. Otherwise, we can't make it happen, and those assumptions might sometimes be wrong. Right, so the third and last project I'm going to discuss is dynamic prediction models. So I alluded already that patient populations, health conditions, healthcare practice tend to change over time. Usually that is a reasonably slow process, but sometimes it is actually very quick. And we've seen that obviously in the pandemic, where things have changed very, very quickly. Now, prediction models, the type of prediction models that we discussed earlier are all static, so they won't change over time, which means that they can become outdated very quickly. So there was a nice example published a number of years ago by Graham Hickey, who used to work in Manchester, is now in Liverpool, based on the Euroscore, which is a model actually that is being used in clinical practice to predict outcomes of cardiac surgery. And over time, the Euroscore predictions kept going up, whereas the actual mortality rate, so this model predicts mortality, kept going down. So essentially what this told us is that the model was becoming more and more outdated. And I think this is happening for a lot of these models. So looking at these data, it's probably better to move on to a different type of model that changes over time, which is always going to be better. So that's what we call a dynamic prediction model. And Dave Jenkins, who's a PhD student in my team, works on this topic. He's published a couple of papers on the topic. If you look at the literature in this area, then you can see three approaches to do this, and this is, basically what you would expect. So the first is updating a model in discrete steps. So every month or every year or so, you update the model. The slightly more radical approach, but also more demanding, is update the model continuously. So whenever a new observation comes in, you update the model. For that, it is naturally to move to Bayesian stats rather than sticking to frequentist stats. And I think in a Bayesian framework, you can do this actually in a very natural way. The final approach that we weren't aware of when we started this actually is something called varying coefficients. So here we model the relation between predictors and outcome as a function of calendar time. So that's quite interesting. Instead of having a constant coefficient, we now have a function of calendar time that tells us how that coefficient is changing over time. Now, obviously, when we move from static to dynamic prediction models, there's a question around what does this do with the prediction modeling lifecycle that we discussed earlier. So clearly, the model updating as a step is now gone because the model itself has become dynamic. But most importantly, this raises questions around validation. Because how do we prove that a model that is changing all the time is still valid, is always valid and accurate? I think that's the main, still unresolved question in this area. And we've looked at different potential approaches to do this, but I don't think we've yet found the ultimate solution. Certain approaches certainly wouldn't work. So, for instance, only validating the initial model. So then you don't know what happens after the model has been updated for a while. One approach would be to validate periodically. And I guess the most advanced approach, but one for which we haven't got the methodology yet, is to validate the initial model plus the updating procedure. So basically prove that the model would always be accurate, regardless of the number of updating steps that have been applied. Okay, so this brings me to my final slide with the summary and take-home messages from my talk. So we've spoken about electronic health records and seen that they are fundamentally different than traditional research data, and this has implications for risk prediction. So they force us to model phenomena like informative presence and informative observation. Secondly, purely predictive models can inform us that decisions have to be made, but they can't help us to make the decisions themselves. They can't tell us what should happen. And so there is an emerging class of interventional or causal prediction models which can support decision making. And this is the second topic that we're working on. And finally, populations and health services are naturally dynamic. They change over time. Taking that into account requires a move from static to dynamic prediction models. That's relatively straightforward to do, but there's a big question mark still around how you validate dynamic prediction models. Okay, I've included a couple of recent papers from our group on this slide. I'll make sure that the slides are made available after the talk. And with that, I'd like to thank my group again for the fantastic work that they've been doing, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Niels. And I have to give a virtual applause. If you have any questions, then you can either type them into the chat or feel free to just switch on your mic and ask Niels. But I'll maybe kick off I mean, it's great to see the ways in which these prediction models can be improved to incorporate all these features. In practice, are there prediction models now that are dynamic, causal, and take into account missingness in a sensible way, or is this quite futuristic?
Yeah, this is quite futuristic. I'm aware of a couple of models. So the first thing perhaps to say is that there are not too many prediction models that are being used in clinical practice. So there's a bit of a translational gap, I would say. If you look at the number of prediction modeling papers that appear in the scientific literature, and then the number of models that are actually being used, for instance, in the NHS, that's quite a difference. I'm aware of one model, I think, that has plugged in causal effect estimates from a trial. So this is in the domain of breast cancer. So it can help you to decide what decision to make. So it's an interventional prediction model. And that one's available online. But otherwise, I'm not aware of any model that would do any of these things. And I think it's, that's quite far away still.
And how feasible is it, do you think, to make causal predictive models from observational data versus doing trials in order to build models? Because I guess in some cases, is it just impossible to make those causal inferences?
It certainly is. It certainly is. Yeah. So I guess, one of the classical examples is lifestyle. So every GP would like to will inform their patients, if they have a high risk of, say, heart disease, of the benefits of lifestyle. And what they tend to do is also use some of the models. So there's a model that they tend to use called Q-risk to illustrate that. But the way they do that is actually wrong, because the model wasn't meant for that. So the numbers that they are then showing are just incorrect. But there's a huge need. But I think lifestyle interventions like smoking, physical activity, etc., is a very good example where I'm not so sure that we will ever have the data to do that, because it's super complex from a confounding perspective, and you would need accurate data from, real life. Again, something that we typically don't have. And
then those kind of problems, there are lots of hidden, latent confounders that you don't know, I suppose.
Exactly.
And probably lots of population stratification that you don't know about as well.
Yeah.
Which is, great. So any questions from Niels, from anyone else? If not, please do feel free to contact Niels, ask for clarification on anything, or if you're interested in following up. The talk is recorded, so you can see the slides. And I think I'm not sure if we'll put a copy of the slides there as well, but either way, you can see them in the video. So let's thank Niels once more. And our next speaker is Nadia Papamichail from the Alliance Manchester Business School. And Nadia is going to talk to us about explanatory tools for probabilistic graphical models. So Nadia, when you're ready, please share your screen.
Yes, thank you.
That's it.
Can you see it?
Yeah. It's perfect.
Thank you, Magnus. I'm Nadia Papamichail, and I'm going to talk about explanatory tools for probabilistic graphical models. And this is indeed one small Turing project that we got. Just let me tell you a few more things about myself and my collaborators. I'm based in the business school, and I used to be a computer scientist, and my research interests fall under the themes of decision analysis, behavior, and support. And many colleagues in the US, they use now the term decision analytics in order really to illustrate this kind of interests. And many years ago, I worked with Jim Smith from the University of Warwick. And we published my first ever paper in artificial intelligence. And when we both became Turing Fellows, and this is the magic of the Turing Institute, we got back together and we had this idea about the project I'm going to discuss today. And we are lucky enough because we have a third collaborator, George Dimitriou. And over here, on this slide, you can see our research interests, decision analytics, Bayesian decision analysis, and natural language processing. And these are three areas, three skills that we needed in order to implement and, this kind of project. This is an overview for my presentation. Is why do we need to talk about this kind of topic? I'm going to show you what we've done with the project, how it is linked to other projects, and then I'm going to have a brief discussion of outputs and our future plans. First of all, just why is it important to talk about explanation systems in any kind of decision setting? Let me give you an example. As an academic, I often have to take decisions that might affect my students, their well-being and their future. Maybe some of the decisions are about marking, or some of the decisions are of the type, whether, to take on an extra PhD student. And when I take this kind of decisions and often agonize over them, I often do the check if the student was facing me, would I be able to defend my decision? Would I be able to explain my decision to the student? And if the answer is yes, then I feel the decision is right. This is a kind of validation. And indeed, this is really the principle of GDPR. If we as human beings have to justify our decisions, then machines and tools that provide predictions or take decisions that affect other people's lives, they have really to justify their own decisions. And at the Turing Institute, there has been a lot of research, and this is, the case for explainability and the case for developing explanation systems has been highlighted by many researchers. For example, David Leslie has led efforts with his reports, but also Sandra Watcher, if I pronounce his surname correctly. They have really put explainability on the Turing map, but also on the map of the wider community. So explainability is a very good fit with many of the Turing priorities, and it's all about providing transparency and all about, it's all about in our efforts in order really to make machine decisions fair, ethical, and transparent. And these are, the aims and objectives. And when I joined the Turing Institute and when I started the project and I put together the proposal, initially my plan was to develop explanation tools in order really to provide contextual and reasoning kind of explanations for probabilistic graphical models. But in our team, just very soon it became very apparent that the emphasis of the project should be on the dialogue, developing a dialogue between different stakeholders, expert domain experts, decision makers, and tools, and the tools that we wanted to develop. And there's also another focus on the facilitation, how to help domain experts out there to construct probabilistic graphical models when it's not really possible to have access to a facilitator or to a human being or a decision analyst. In the Turing and in the wider community of data scientists and artificial intelligence developers, this is a very typical workflow where people try to develop usually a black box kind of technology, and then they provide the outputs of the system to a potential user. And if there is an explanation component, then it's all about providing some post hoc explanations about the output, and in some cases, depending on the black box technology that has been used, maybe there is a chance to add transparency into the system, but providing a bit of information about the logic of the model. But again, this depends on the technology used in the black box. But let me now show you what I do. I really help people develop decision models in order really to take decisions that matter. And Niels, before, that was it was a happy coincidence that, we were paired together. But, the emphasis of my own research is on helping people to devise the best course of action. But usually, it's all about, I have acted before as a decision analyst and a facilitator, and I help people to develop their own decision model. My collaborator, Jim Smith, who really wanted very much to be here today, but all day today he's committed to a decision workshop with some clients, and they're trying to establish and capture a probabilistic graphical model. And the projects, examples of projects that Jim, for example, has developed for the Turing Institute is a probabilistic graphical model to calculate the risk of a terrorist or of a criminal who is about to be reintroduced to society, and what is the risk of reoffending again. But when it comes to these probabilistic graphical models, you can have them in many different domains. For example, climate change. What's the probability of a comet, hitting planet Earth, or a probabilistic graphical model, for example, about the population of bees that have been decreasing. And in this kind of setting, we have a decision analyst and a facilitator who helps a group, one decision domain expert or a group of domain experts, in order really to capture this probabilistic graphical model that describes the essence, and the logic of making predictions about risk. In these particular settings, as I said before, we assume that we have the presence of a decision analyst or a facilitator. But then what happens in cases where the data is confidential or sensitive, and perhaps the domain experts, they don't really want to use a decision analyst or a facilitator, or perhaps it's very costly in order to have continuous access to a facilitator. If we don't have an analyst or a facilitator, this is where we come along. And this is really what we want to do as a team. We really want to develop explanatory tools to replace facilitators in decision workshops, so that instead of having interactions between domain experts and a facilitator in order to build the probabilistic graphical model, what we want to do is to have a dialogue between the tool and the experts. And some of the explanations will be inferred, from the structure of the network, or from the kind of values and probabilities we might have. But there might be some cases where the domain experts, in this dialogue with the tool, they might think, just how there is another variable of interest that I did not really include in my model. So maybe, they might be able to deduce and go back. So we have really these kind of interactions going both ways. And these are the research choices we have made. We call our tools Galaxa, and the vision is to develop a suite or a family of tools that can have chatbot functionalities. So if you wonder why we chose the name Galaxa, the idea was that at the time when we coined the term, just many people we knew were using Alexa, and we thought, what we want to do, and this is the long-term vision, is to develop Alexa kind of tools for probabilistic graphical models. Then when it came to probabilistic graphical models, we decided to focus on Bayesian networks. I have to say that when I joined the Turing Institute, and this is my own personal observation, but I would say a very high percentage of Turing Fellows and many people associated with the Institute, they do they apply Bayesian kind of methodologies, but in our case, we focus on Bayesian networks. They have been used, in many applications. My collaborator, Jim Smith, has written a book, on the Bayesian decision analysis. So that was really, for the very, very beginning, that was our aim. I had developed explanatory tools for other domains. Jim has done a lot of research with Bayesian networks, so it was really a very good fit to do this kind of thing. So when George joined us with his expertise in natural language processing, we had a very good mix. And I would like to reiterate that the applications we are focusing upon are applications where it's very difficult to hire a facilitator, or perhaps the information is sensitive or confidential. Now we have a decision facilitator, like someone like Jim Smith, who interacts with decision experts in order to build the probabilistic graphical model. What is the process? Because if we want really to replace the decision analyst and replicate this kind of dialogues between tools and domain experts, it's very, very important to have a high-level overview of the decision analysis process that is being followed in order really to elicit probabilities, or in order to elicit the structure of the probabilistic graphical model. And I have to say that if you open textbooks, this is not the kind of information you can find in textbooks. Usually in papers, people present the final product. And many facilitators will tell you it is a kind of art how you can guide people in order to develop this kind of models. But the first phase is, the initial structure, where people start to think about the problem, to try to make sense of the problem. And they try really to think what are the variables that are really of interest and what are their dependencies. And then in the second stage, it's more about refining the graph and refining the structure. In the third phase, it's all about eliciting probabilities, and there are some very well-established techniques and approaches, like Shelf or Roger Cook. They have done a lot of work in the area. And finally, just at the end is this kind of verification. Am I happy with the final product? Have I got a graph with the right kind of variables? Maybe, should I include any other variables? This kind of thing. And this is an example of a Bayesian network, and I'm not going to bore you with details. I think those of you who have expertise in the area, you will recognize this example. It is really a toy example that many people use in the textbooks or when they teach. And we have got this example from the Nadia software that helps users to develop Bayesian belief networks. But in this particular example, we have a number of potential diseases, for example, tuberculosis, lung cancer, bronchitis. We have some output variables, X-ray results or dyspnea. But, this is the kind of explanation and the query, just if we had a domain expert, or if we had a user directly interacting with this tool, this is the kind of question they could have. For example, what is the probability that a patient that comes through the door, so what is the probability that this patient has a diagnosis of cancer or tuberculosis based on the fact that the person is a smoker and or has traveled abroad? So it is this kind of setting. So given this, what we want to do is, on top of the Bayesian belief network that is being displayed in a software like Nadia, to have a kind of Alexa chatbot. And this chatbot is going to be a dialogue-based system that is going to help users to construct and interrogate Bayesian networks. And there are two aims here. The first aim is to develop an explanatory tool in order really to develop explanations at the end, so that people get, if they ask, what is the probability of that? What is the probability of this? If I observe this, and so on. But also the second aim is, this kind of facilitation. How can we help domain experts out there to develop their own Bayesian networks? How can we facilitate this kind of interactions between the Bayesian network and the domain experts? Over here, I'm trying to answer, some questions you might have. Why Natica? It's easy to use, powerful program, and also for the other different components of our Galaxy tools. We have used, for example, for the dialogue module, we have used RASA, or for the explanation module, we have used SQL NLG. And if you have any questions about these particular tools, the solution has been developed by my collaborator, George Dimitriou, who is attending the presentations today. And I've noted before that I think it was Magnus said, if you want really if you have any questions, you can use the chat facility. And George will be also available via chat if you want really to get quick answers to any questions you might have about the natural language generation component. And this is really the high-level architecture of the tool. We have the user, and the user says, I would like really to construct a Bayes net. And then, just one component is the chatbot, and the chatbot has two parts. One part does text understandability, and the other one is all about managing the dialogue. So the first really task is to establish the intent. So when someone says, I would like really to create a Bayes net, what is the intent of that? And then, just after establishing the intent of the query, then the next step is to devise a number of action plans, because very often, just there are follow-up questions and it is about really devising an action plan in order to interrogate the user or the domain expert a bit further in order really to elicit more information about the structure of the model or about the probabilities. And just once the structure and of the network has been established and probability elicitation has taken place, it is possible then to invoke Natica and display the Bayesian network on Natica. And then we have another simple NLG kind of solution in order really to generate explanations. And over here I have an example. For example, the answer to the question, what is the probability of tuberculosis, given that the X-ray is abnormal and there was a visit abroad, then you can have this kind of explanation by the natural language generator. I would like really to just two takeaway messages from this. The first takeaway message is we have not really tried to replicate the whale. That was a small Turing project. What we wanted to do is we wanted really to develop a proof of concept to demonstrate that our ideas worked. So it was not really our intention, for example, to develop a visualization tool for Bayesian networks when there are tools out there like Natica that do exactly that. So it was all about using open source technology in order really to develop our solution. And this is really, and the other takeaway message is that, this is work in progress because, we have completed the 6-month project, but we have really continued with our meetings and in order really to develop a complete solution and that can be used in decision semantics, where the aim is to develop a complete Bayesian belief network. And so far, what we have done is we have implemented this kind of chatbot where we have basic kind of conversations between a user and the chatbot component of Galaxa. And also we have completed this kind of interaction between the explanation generator and Natica. So it is possible for the explanation generator to invoke the API of Natica and answer some of the questions. But what we haven't done is, and this is now the next step, is to integrate all these components together, because the final aim is to develop an integrated decision support system that can provide, just a unique solution to our problem. Now, what is the link? This is, as I said, work in progress, but there are other spin-offs in place. And something else that I do is about the effect of explanations on different users. I am one of the believers that one size does not really fit all, and people out there, they're very different. So when you have any kind of system, it can be a black box or it can be a probabilistic or a risk model, and that system provides explanations to a user. That's not really enough because you don't really know how people use the explanation. And if the system is in the health sector, for example, and Niels has given some amazing examples and he's been doing a lot of work, but if you have a system that gives a risk estimation and communicates to a patient, for example, that the probability of you having cancer or in later life, or the probability of diabetes in later life is this, the $1 million question or the £1 million question, in my opinion, is yes, but what is next? Is it possible to change behavior? So can we go a step further and not only to generate explanations, but also kind of do a bit of nudging, try to influence behavior and try really to help people to devise the best intervention plan for them and how we can help them to do that. And I'm lucky enough, we just got a targeted PhD scholarship, and this is a collaboration with another fellow, a Manchester fellow this time, Ken Muir. And in our team, we have epidemiology people, we have marketing people. I have done a lot of work on decision behavior, and it's all about if we take into account individual characteristics, for example, decision-making style, information processing style, how can we personalize the explanation messages we send to our users in order really to initiate intervention plans and changes, lifestyle changes in them. So a PhD, we've just appointed a PhD student, and he's going to keep us busy for the next three or 4 years. Of course, I have done a lot of research. This is really my passion. And before, when Niels was giving his presentation, he was saying how important it is to identify the best course of action, sometimes from preventing diseases. And I'm also very passionate about the power of decision analytics. It's all about how we can use a range of different methods in order to help policymakers, decision makers to devise the best course of action. It might be an intervention. And this is really what I do. And the idea here is, if we have developed a methodology that really works with probabilistic graphical models, can we use the same blueprint high-level methodology and apply it to another domain? This is a collaboration with Professor Theo Stewart, who is another professor of statistics, and George as well had joined us, and we're developing dialogue systems for settings where people have to make value trade-offs, in order really to decide what is the best course of action. When I looked at the decision analytics literature, not the AI literature, in order to see what are the benefits of these explanatory tools, this is what other researchers have said. It's all about transparency, engagement, having access to an audit trail, being satisfied, empowered to take decisions, confidence, trust. Trust is very important. To trust the message, to trust the person or the tool that conveys the message. But if you ask me, and something I haven't really seen in the literature, it's all about clarity, because at the end of the day, this is why we use models. We use models in order really to help us gain this kind of clarity. And I was talking to a decision professional not a long time ago, and who is based in the US. And he was telling me, because he has a consultancy company and he helps companies devise influence diagrams. And he said sometimes, there's a lot of effort to develop a probabilistic graphical model. But then once you have it, sometimes people don't even need to put and plug in probabilities. They can see what the best course of action is just by exploring the space. And that, I think, for me, this is really my aim, really, to develop tools that help decision makers or policy makers in order to gain this kind of clarity. So this is really to finalize, just a couple of outputs from this 6-month project. Our priority is to develop, just an integrated dialogue system. And we believe that there are many cases in the security and defense area in order really to apply our ideas. So I'm going to finish here.
Thanks, Nadia. And just turn my a bit. So if there's any questions, please, you can just turn your mic on and ask, or you can type them in the chat. Nadia, I noticed that in the original Lauritsen and Spiegelhalter paper, where your example came from, they called the Bayesian networks causal networks, which links to Niels's talk before. But the statistical relationship between the variables isn't necessarily causal. I mean, you can have the same Bayesian network and change the direction of arrows, and it still represents the statistical relationship of the variables correctly. So in your examples, in the networks where you apply this, are you trying to represent the causal structure, or just the probability distribution relating the variables?
Yes, just my collaborator Jim as well has devised a phase, and actually Anne Nicholson as well, from Monash University, has done a lot of work in the area. How can we capture the kind of structure of the the Bayesian network? Now this is not an easy task. It's very difficult, but the thesis of our work is that if you provide explanation to people, especially explanations that appear to be a bit counterintuitive, people will say, oh, hang on a minute, why did I get this explanation? Perhaps there is a missing variable there that I did not really think of before. And it is this kind of explanations that we hope they are going to trigger this kind of thoughts in people in order really to think, oh, perhaps, the network is not very well structured.
Right. So you see it as a bit of an iterative tool where you can test your assumptions and spot things that seem inconsistent, and then change the network.
Yes. But I have to say, right now, what we've done is we have, because we started with this part, which is more about, providing explanation about probabilities. But of course, that was a 6-month project. But this is now our aim now to place an emphasis on the interrogation part, because we think this is going to be really our contribution. This is our main contribution, how we can help people to devise the structure as well. But this is a much bigger problem, and this is our aim really to. So we're going to be really busy writing proposals to identify funding sources in order really to focus on this phase.
Do you think that the network, your system can it then sort of query people about their beliefs? Could it say, do you think this causes this, or in order to kind of, learn that causal network?
Yes, and this is actually our aim is the more we use the tool in practice, the more the tool is going to learn, because, the chatbot is going to have a learning component. So the more we feed dialogues to the system, the more the system is going to become sensitive to this kind of questions. But unfortunately, right now, it's not as if we can feed ready-made kind of dialogues that we can find in textbooks or anything into the system. And we need, I think ideally, once we start developing the system, we need more and more dialogues to be inserted so that we can improve performance.
That's interesting. It's quite hard to elicit people's prior beliefs from them.
Yeah.
So maybe a dialogue system is a way of actually extracting people's prior beliefs.
Yes, And often I tell Jim, I wish I was a fly on the wall when you did your workshops, because I have facilitated workshops myself, but it was all about these high-stake kind of decisions where you have value trade-offs. But he does many workshops where he elicits probabilities, and he also tries really to build this kind of networks. And I guess, you know, if this is funded, you know, this is going to be part of the job, really, to accumulate many instances, or maybe we can organize many decision workshops to see how people can use this kind of thing in practice, and how decision analysts like Jim, how they interact with domain experts in order to build these very complex models. You know, that's the aim.
Excellent. So any questions from Nadia? Everyone's been very shy, it seems. I thought it was interesting. I didn't appreciate there were going to be such strong links between your part and Niels's part, actually.
Yes.
So it sounds like this kind of whole area of using models for decisions, predictions, actions, causal inference is, you know, huge in kind of the business side, but also in the health side. So it seems like there's strong links there that we can maybe build on between those two. It just leaves me to thank everyone. And these were the last 2 of 10 Turing project presentations. I thought it was really interesting. Oh, we've got a question here, have we? Yes, okay, so there's a comment from George that the main task of the dialogue system is concerned with generation of the BaseNet, but the explanatory facilities are concerned with realization of prediction outcomes. So I guess it's both, right? So it's eliciting a model from the dialogue and also explaining decisions. Yeah. I mean, I think it sounds like a great application for natural language on top of these probabilistic models. Really nice. It just we're just left to thank Nadia, and let's thank Niels again. We have to do it virtually. I can do it in real life. And thank you, everyone. So great. Bye-bye.